The desert wind carried the smell of smoke and diesel across northern Tunisia. It was May 13th, 1943, the day the war in Africa finally died. On the rocky hills near Cape Bone, the last remnants of the German Afrika Korps laid down their arms. The once proud formations that had driven the British to the gates of Egypt now stood in silence, surrounded by Allied soldiers. Across the dunes stretched a sight no one thought possible. Endless columns of prisoners, more than 250,000 German and Italian troops moving under the white flags of surrender. The campaign that began with Rommel's lightning victories had ended in total collapse. Tanks sat half buried in sand, their fuel long gone. Trucks lay overturned on desert roads. The black crosses on German helmets were now coated with dust, their shine replaced by exhaustion. For the men of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, this was not only a military defeat, it was a collapse of belief. They had been told that surrender to the Allies meant torture, starvation, and death. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as mongrel mercenaries, British soldiers as imperial butchers, and French troops as African savages. As Allied guards herded them into columns, many German officers braced for humiliation. A captured lieutenant from the 10th Panzer Division later wrote, "I expected to be beaten, spat on, or worse. Instead, the British offered us water." The sun hung low and merciless, yet Allied medics moved through the lines tending to the wounded, German and Italian alike. They cut away scorched uniforms, bandaged burns, and shared morphine. Nearby, an American private handed out cigarettes to dazed prisoners. One German hesitated before taking one, as if expecting a trick. The young American just shrugged. "Smoke up," he said. For the prisoners, it was the first crack in everything they had been told. At the Allied command post near Hammamet, General Harold Alexander's staff prepared the surrender documents. Outside, a convoy of captured German generals waited in silence, their iron crosses gleaming faintly in the North African sun. Among them was General Jürgen von Arnim, commander of Army Group Africa. He removed his gloves, saluted stiffly, and said only, "The Afrika Korps no longer exists." The war in Africa had ended, but for the men who had fought it, another kind of battle was just beginning. The surrender camps filled quickly. The Allies had not expected to capture so many prisoners at once. By nightfall, makeshift barbed wire enclosures dotted the Tunisian coast. Trucks loaded with bread and water arrived from British and American supply depots. The prisoners, weak from weeks of bombardment and hunger, watched in disbelief as Allied cooks set up field kitchens. A German sergeant who had fought at Al Alamein later said, "They fed us before they fed their own men." Even the guards were surprised by the orders. The Allied command, following the Geneva Convention, had issued strict instructions: no retaliation, no cruelty, no revenge. "We fight soldiers, not prisoners," one British officer reminded his men. It was discipline born of moral conviction, and it left the defeated Germans completely disoriented. In the camp near Goulet, hundreds of Germans sat in stunned silence, clutching tin cups filled with soup. A few dared to smile, awkwardly thanking the cooks in broken English. One German mechanic whispered to his friend, "This is not what Berlin told us." The other nodded, staring into the bowl. "No," he said softly, "this is civilization." Far from the front lines, reporters sent dispatches describing the unprecedented scale of the surrender. The New York Times wrote, "The Axis armies of North Africa have ceased to exist." But the headlines could not capture the quiet transformation happening inside those wire fences. For the first time, the myth of Nazi superiority met the reality of Allied humanity. The desert nights grew cold, and the POWs huddled together under tarps and blankets, provided by their captors. Overhead, Allied bombers droned toward Sicily, the next battlefield, while German prisoners watched silently, wondering if their homeland would soon feel the same fire. Some prayed, others simply stared into the sand, their faces lit by the faint glow of campfires. At dawn, an American chaplain walked through the camp. He carried no weapon, only a Bible. The guards snapped to attention as he passed, but he just nodded, politely, and entered the tent where wounded Germans lay on stretchers. He spoke softly, offering water and prayers. One young prisoner, no more than 19, asked him in broken English, "Why help us? We are your enemy." The chaplain smiled faintly. "Today, maybe. Tomorrow, who knows? You're still men." Word spread quickly through the camp. The Americans had doctors, priests, even orchestra players among them. One night, a U.S. Army band played for the guards, and soon, laughter and applause drifted from behind the wire. German soldiers, men who weeks earlier had fired on Allied convoys, clapped to the rhythm of American jazz. For many, it was their first glimpse of the culture they'd been taught to despise. As the days passed, the prisoners' fear began to fade, replaced by curiosity. They watched American soldiers write letters home, saw British officers sharing tea with their men, and noticed something they had rarely seen in their own army: respect between ranks. The strict brutality of Nazi discipline, the shouting of officers, the endless propaganda speeches, all of it felt like a distant, almost unreal memory. For the Allies, their victory in Tunisia was more than just military. It was moral. General Eisenhower wrote in his field report, "The treatment of prisoners is a reflection of who we are. We do not destroy what we have defeated." That philosophy would soon define the Allied approach across every front. In the Tunisian desert, under the watchful eyes of their captors, the once mighty Afrika Korps began to see the world through a new lens. Their uniforms were torn, their medals tarnished, but their humanity, the thing their regime had tried to bury, was beginning to resurface. And though they didn't know it yet, the journey ahead, across the sea, to America itself, would change them forever. When the German prisoners of the Afrika Korps were rounded up after their surrender, most expected the same fate they had been taught to fear since the beginning of the war. In the final weeks before capture, Nazi officers had circulated terrifying rumors that the Americans tortured prisoners, that the British shot them in cold blood, that surrender meant slavery or starvation. To the weary men now being loaded into trucks under the Tunisian sun, it seemed only logical. They had bombed Allied convoys, destroyed villages, and fought ferociously in every battle from Tobruk to Kasserine. Surely their captors would seek revenge. Yet as the convoys rolled out of the battlefield toward the coast, something strange happened. No one beat them. No one cursed them. The Allied soldiers who guarded the trucks simply offered water and told them to sit tight. The silence was confusing. The journey to the temporary holding camps near Bizerta and Golette took hours across a landscape of shattered armor and burned-out half-tracks. British and American MPs rode alongside the columns, alert but calm. The prisoners, stripped of weapons and insignia, waited for the inevitable cruelty. Instead, when the truck stopped, they found rows of tents, field kitchens already cooking, and water tanks gleaming in the sun. "Form lines," a British sergeant shouted. The Germans braced for punishment, but the order that followed stunned them. Hot stew first, then medical inspection. For many, it was the first hot meal they had eaten in days. Thick lentil soup, bread, and coffee. The smell alone felt unreal. One prisoner, a young Panzer Grenadier from the 21st Panzer Division, later wrote in his diary, "I did not understand. They gave us food before they ate themselves. It was like a dream." The medics worked through the night,
bandaging wounds, setting broken bones, and even stitching torn uniforms to protect the men from the chill. Allied doctors did not ask about rank or uniform. Whether Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, or Italian Alpini, every prisoner was treated the same, a patient, not an enemy. The disbelief spread like wildfire through the ranks. A Luftwaffe mechanic, his arm in a sling, whispered to his comrade, "The English treat us better than our own officers." It wasn't an exaggeration. Under the German command system, enlisted men often endured brutal discipline and shortages of food. The Afrika Korps had long been undersupplied, their rations cut, while headquarters dined well. Now, sitting in the dust eating American corned beef, the irony was impossible to ignore. Allied command had anticipated the flood of prisoners. General Dwight Eisenhower's staff had ordered strict adherence to the Geneva Convention of 1929, ensuring humane treatment for all POWs. This was not mere compassion, it was policy. The Allies understood that moral conduct was as powerful a weapon as any rifle. Eisenhower himself told his officers, "How we treat the enemy reflects who we are. We are not them." In an age of total war, that principle was revolutionary. At Camp 132 near Bizerta, British officers ensured discipline but forbade abuse. Guards were instructed to maintain professionalism, no shouting, no striking, no humiliation. Even Nazi officers, accustomed to screaming at their subordinates, were unnerved by the quiet authority of their captors. The English do not yell, but their orders are obeyed. For the Americans, most of whom were young farm boys from Kansas, Iowa, or Pennsylvania, the sight of so many German soldiers was surreal. To them, the prisoners were not monsters, just tired men. Many had never seen an enemy up close before. When an American corporal offered cigarettes to a group of German POWs, one refused, suspicious. The corporal just grinned and lit two, one for himself, one for the German. "It's not poison, Fritz, we've got plenty." The small gesture broke the tension. Within minutes, dozens of prisoners were smoking, some even laughing quietly. By the third day, the camp was operating like a strange, temporary town. Prisoners organized cleaning details, dug latrines, and repaired tents. A few fluent English speakers volunteered as interpreters. Allied officers noticed something remarkable. Once the initial fear faded, the Germans became cooperative, even disciplined. They are soldiers first, and soldiers respect order even in defeat. News of their humane treatment began to spread beyond Tunisia. American and British reporters visiting the camps were astonished at what they found. Photos of neatly dressed German prisoners eating from metal trays appeared in newspapers back home under headlines like "Fair Play for Foes." Propaganda leaflets soon followed, dropped over German lines in Sicily and Italy, showing captured soldiers being fed, clothed, and housed under the caption, "The Allies fight soldiers, not slaves." To the prisoners, every day brought new surprises. Some were given books, others helped repair trucks or build furniture for the camp. One evening, a British sergeant organized a soccer match between the guards and the POWs. It ended in laughter when a German forward accidentally tackled the referee. For a moment, the war felt far away. "It was strange," one participant recalled, "but for 90 minutes, we were all just men playing football in the desert." Not everyone accepted this reality easily. Among the captives were hardened SS men and devoted Nazis who viewed kindness as weakness. Some tried to enforce party discipline, organizing whispered meetings, and refusing to salute Allied officers. But even they found it difficult to maintain authority. The daily routine, the meals, the order, the fairness, slowly eroded the fear and fanaticism that had defined their service. As one British chaplain put it, "Humanity is contagious. Once they see it, they can't unsee it." Outside the wire, Tunisia was transforming. Allied convoys streamed toward ports, loading equipment for the next invasion, Sicily. The war machine moved on, but within the camps, time seemed to slow. Prisoners wrote letters home through the Red Cross, describing the strange world they now lived in. They let us write. They treat us like men. I do not understand this America. The Allied command understood perfectly. This treatment wasn't charity. It was strategy. Every German soldier who returned home after the war would carry the memory of how the enemy had behaved. It would plant a seed of doubt in the heart of a generation raised on lies. By late May, the first ships were ready to carry thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic. The men who once believed they would die in the desert now stood on the decks of Liberty ships staring westward. Some wept. Others stared in silence, still waiting for the cruelty that never came. As the African coast disappeared behind them, one captured officer murmured, "If this is defeat, it is more honorable than our victory ever was." He didn't know it yet, but America would soon prove that the strength of a nation wasn't measured only in tanks or bombs, but in how it treated those who had fallen before it.
The voyage to America began under a blazing North African sun. At the docks of Bizerte and Oran, long columns of German prisoners, sunburned, underfed, and silent, marched toward the waiting Liberty ships. Allied guards stood watch, rifles slung casually, their manner firm but not cruel. Most of the prisoners expected misery. They had been told that being sent to America meant slave labor in mines or starvation in chain gangs. What awaited them instead would upend everything they believed about their enemies and, in time, about their own country. The Liberty ships were packed to capacity. Each held nearly 1,000 POWs, guarded by American soldiers who had fought them only weeks earlier in the Tunisian hills. The Germans were given the same rations as the guards: corned beef, bread, beans, coffee, and sometimes even fruit. They were issued blankets, allowed on deck for fresh air, and permitted to write censored postcards home through the Red Cross. "We are alive," one soldier wrote in disbelief, "and treated with fairness by the Americans." The voyage was long, 12 days across a restless Atlantic. U-boat threats loomed, but few German prisoners expressed loyalty to the submarines that might sink them. "We wanted to live," one Luftwaffe mechanic recalled. "We prayed the U-boats would miss." The guards, too, seemed surprised at how quiet their captives were. They talked little, smoked much, and stared westward at the horizon as if unsure whether the new world was real or another Allied trick. When the ships reached the ports of Norfolk, New York, and Boston, crowds gathered to watch. Americans lining the docks were astonished by the sheer number of enemy soldiers, thousands disembarking, marching in orderly silence. They weren't monsters or fanatics, as the posters had shown. They looked like tired young men, no older than the American farm boys who guarded them. One dock worker in Norfolk was heard saying, "Hell, they look like us." From the ports, the prisoners were loaded onto trains bound for camps scattered across the American South and Midwest. Their destinations were remote: Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Gruber in Oklahoma, Camp Shanks in New York, Camp Gordon in Georgia, and dozens more hidden among pine forests and farmlands. To the prisoners, the landscape was a dream. Endless fields, bright red barns, wide rivers, and skies unscarred by bombers. At Camp Swift, a young Wehrmacht corporal named Friedrich Kruger stepped off the train expecting barbed wire and brutality. What he found instead astonished him. The camp was clean, well-organized, and quiet. The barracks were wooden, with bunk beds and heating stoves. There was a mess hall, an infirmary, a library, and even a soccer field. The guards greeted the new arrivals politely, directing them through processing. Each man received a uniform marked PW, a mattress, soap, and toothbrush. They were told in clear English and repeated in German the rules of the camp.
no escape attempts, no violence, and full compliance with the Geneva Convention would guarantee safety and food. For most of the Germans, the discipline and fairness of the system felt surreal. In the Third Reich, authority came through shouting and fear. Here, even the American MPs gave orders calmly. They did not scream, they simply expected obedience, and they received it. Daily life in the camps soon took on a rhythm that seemed almost peaceful. Reveille sounded at 6:30 a.m., followed by roll call. Breakfast was hot, scrambled eggs, oatmeal, and coffee. Afterward, able-bodied prisoners were sent to work details. Some labored on farms, harvesting cotton or cutting sugar cane. Others worked in sawmills or helped repair roads and railways. For their labor, they were paid in canteen coupons, which could be used to buy cigarettes, chocolate, or stationery. In the evenings, prisoners were free to read, write letters, or attend educational programs organized by the U.S. Army's Prisoner of War Education Division. Lectures on American democracy, English language, and world geography were common. One German officer noted bitterly, "We are being re-educated by kindness." But many welcomed it. They devoured the books in the camp libraries, debated politics, and played chess or football on weekends. The guards, too, began to see their captives differently. These were not fanatics from the propaganda reels. Many were just soldiers doing their duty. Some guards even developed a quiet respect for their discipline. "They're cleaner and more polite than our own recruits," one Texan sergeant joked, "and they never miss roll call." Occasionally, small tensions flared, ideological clashes between hardened Nazis and those disillusioned by defeat. The Americans, wary of internal conflict, began separating true believers from ordinary soldiers. Camps were divided into zones. The more moderate POWs quickly outnumbered the extremists. The SS shouted, but no one listened anymore. The war was over for us. We had seen the real world. In many places, the Germans became part of local life. Farmers hired them for harvests, paying the government for their labor. In Texas and Louisiana, POWs picked cotton under the same sun as American farmhands. Some townsfolk were nervous at first. The idea of Nazis working in nearby fields sounded terrifying. But fear turned to curiosity. Housewives brought them lemonade, children watched them play soccer, and local newspapers began printing stories about their good behavior. "They're polite and hard-working, and they sure can fix a tractor," one farmer said. The food amazed them most of all. In Germany, rations were shrinking and meat was rare. In America, even prisoners ate beef, bread, and fruit daily. "We were prisoners, but we ate like kings compared to home," one man said. Mail service connected them with families in the ruins of Europe. Through the Red Cross, letters arrived, sometimes months late, but always cherished. They learned that their cities were bombed, their families hungry, their homeland collapsing. For many, the realization was devastating. Yet in the safety of their captivity, surrounded by abundance and fairness, a quiet transformation began. One POW, reflecting in a letter home, wrote, "I used to think our enemies were beasts. Now I see they are people who live without fear. They are free because they trust one another. I hope someday Germany learns this too." The guards noticed it as well. The men who had arrived sullen and defiant began smiling, volunteering for extra work, even singing while they labored. The contrast between the propaganda they had believed and the reality they now lived became impossible to deny. As summer deepened, thousands of German soldiers found themselves unexpectedly at peace in the very land they had been told was their enemy. And although they were fenced in by barbed wire, for the first time in years, many felt something dangerously close to freedom. By the winter of 1943, America's landscape was dotted with small, self-contained cities of captured enemies. Over 400,000 German prisoners now lived behind American barbed wire. From the rolling plains of Texas to the pine forests of Minnesota,
and the cotton fields of Georgia, the men who had once fought under Hitler's banner were waking each day to the rhythm of life in the land they had been taught to hate. What they saw and what they experienced would forever alter their understanding of war, freedom, and humanity. Inside Camp Swift, life moved with an order that many POWs found strangely comforting. The daily routine, roll call, work details, meals, recreation, was carried out with mechanical precision but without cruelty. The guards rarely shouted. The food was consistent. The rules were clear. In the evenings, the camp came alive with activity. Football matches, choirs, orchestras, even classes in mathematics, literature, and American civics. The prisoners organized their own theater groups, staging plays by Goethe or Shakespeare. The U.S. Army encouraged it all, believing that discipline and dignity were essential to maintaining morale and to re-educating the men who had once sworn loyalty to a dictator. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, a group of former university students built a small newspaper using typewriters and scrap paper. Its editorials began cautiously, discussing neutral topics like agriculture and sports, but soon shifted toward reflections on politics and ethics. We were told that democracy was chaos, but here, even in captivity, I see order without oppression. It is a powerful thing, one editor wrote. The guards noticed the change. Captain Robert Winfield, who oversaw one section of Camp Swift, wrote in his diary, "They came here soldiers of Hitler. They will leave here men." That transformation wasn't accidental. It was the quiet product of American policy. Washington saw POW camps not only as containment zones, but as laboratories for democracy. The Army's Prisoner of War Education program distributed reading material carefully selected by military psychologists, texts on American history, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Chaplains organized discussions about ethics and moral responsibility. For some prisoners, the ideas were confusing. For others, they were liberating. Still, not everyone embraced this awakening. A small but dangerous minority of die-hard Nazis, often members of the Waffen-SS, sought to maintain ideological control. They formed secret cells, held night meetings, and intimidated others who spoke favorably of the Allies. In one notorious case at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a moderate prisoner named Johannes Kunze was beaten to death by his fellow Germans after praising America's fairness. His murder horrified both guards and captives alike. The Army responded by separating hardline Nazis into special isolation camps, cutting them off from the general population. The message was clear: fanaticism would not survive here. In most camps, however, a new spirit began to take root. Former enemies began seeing the guards, young Americans from small towns and farms, as individuals, not symbols. Conversations bloomed during work details or cigarette breaks. Many guards, seeing the humanity in their captives, dropped their hostility as well. "You stop hating a man when you shared coffee with him," one GI said. Friendships, while forbidden, quietly formed. Local American communities, too, began to soften. Farmers who had feared the Nazis in their fields now praised their diligence. School children peered curiously through fences, sometimes tossing baseballs back and forth with the POWs. In Wisconsin, locals would sneak pies or Christmas cards to the camp gates. In Georgia, a church choir performed carols outside a POW camp, and the prisoners responded with a haunting rendition of Stille Nacht. For many on both sides, those small exchanges of music and mercy felt like the war's only sanity. Among the prisoners, the contrast between propaganda and reality became unbearable. In Germany, they had been told that Americans were decadent, racially impure, and godless. But here they saw a society that, for all its flaws, functioned on trust and fairness. A society where a sergeant could argue with a captain and not be shot, where newspapers criticized leaders without fear, and where even the enemy was fed. A Luftwaffe officer, educated before the Nazi rise to power, told an army chaplain, "Now I understand what Germany lost when it lost its conscience." Letters sent home through the Red Cross
carried fragments of these revelations. Many were censored, but enough slipped through to reveal a startling truth. The men were not being abused, they were being treated with dignity. The impact on morale within Germany was subtle but profound. Civilians who received those letters began questioning the propaganda that painted the Allies as monsters. Some even began to hope that surrender might mean survival, not annihilation. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence officers recognized the psychological power of this reality. They began deliberately publicizing the humane treatment of POWs, using it as a weapon against Nazi fear. Every German soldier captured, one report noted, is a potential witness to the moral bankruptcy of the Reich. The strategy worked. Prisoners taken later in the war surrendered more readily, often quoting the experiences of those captured in Africa. America is not cruel. As the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, new groups of POWs arrived. Men from Italy, from Normandy, from the collapsing Eastern Front. Many were younger, hungrier, more desperate. They arrived angry, defiant, shouting Nazi slogans. But within weeks, the same pattern repeated. Suspicion gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to quiet acceptance. One camp psychologist observed, "Kindness disarms more surely than bullets." The moral effect worked both ways. For the Americans, guarding their enemies became a lesson in restraint, proof that democracy could exist even under the strain of total war. Guards learned to see discipline not as cruelty, but as consistency. Power not as domination, but as responsibility. "You don't fight fascism by imitating it," wrote one sergeant in a letter home. "You fight it by being everything it can't be." By the time the winter snow blanketed the camps, something unthinkable had happened. Inside the barbed wire, surrounded by watchtowers and floodlights, thousands of Germans began to rediscover a piece of themselves they had buried under years of obedience and fear. They were no longer just soldiers of a fallen army. They were witnesses to a moral awakening. And though the war still raged across Europe, these men had already begun their first steps toward a quiet, personal peace. They were learning, from the very nation they had tried to destroy, that true strength was not born from terror, but from decency.
By the spring of 1945, as the Allied armies marched into the heart of a ruined Germany, the prisoners in America knew the war was ending. The radios in their camps, once forbidden, now carried news bulletins of Hitler's death, Berlin's fall, and Germany's unconditional surrender. For months afterward, a strange silence hung over the compounds. The men who had once dreamed of returning as heroes now faced the uncertainty of returning to a homeland in ashes. The process of repatriation began slowly. The U.S. Army faced a logistical nightmare, hundreds of thousands of German POWs scattered across North America, each needing processing, health checks, and transport. Some would be sent first to Britain or France for labor duty before returning to Germany. Others would go straight home. But before they left, something remarkable happened. Many didn't want to go. At Camp Hearn, Texas, when the news of Germany's surrender reached the prisoners, there was no cheering, no singing, only stunned silence. A few men wept openly. "We no longer had a country," one prisoner later wrote. "We were Germans without Germany." In the following weeks, Army officers conducted interviews, preparing the men for departure. To their astonishment, a significant number requested to stay. "We'll work, we'll farm, anything," they pleaded, "just don't send us back yet." For most, however, homecoming was unavoidable. Starting in late 1945, trainloads of POWs rolled east to the ports of New York, Boston, and Norfolk, where Liberty ships waited to carry them across the Atlantic. The American guards shook hands with many of them as they boarded. Some exchanged addresses, promising to write, a forbidden but deeply human act. One Texan sergeant gave his German prisoner a small Bible with the inscription, "Freedom begins inside." The man kept it for the rest of his life. The voyage home was nothing like the fearful crossing they had made 2 years earlier. The men were clean, healthy, and well-fed. They stood at the rails watching the vast ocean,
no longer afraid of U-boats or Allied guns. Many talked quietly about what they would find in the ruins of their cities. Others wondered whether the world they had seen in America, orderly, abundant, democratic, could ever exist in their homeland. When the ships docked in Bremerhaven, what they found was devastation. Entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced by piles of rubble. Rail stations stood roofless. Factories were hollow shells. Their families were thin, weary, and wary of the men returning from captivity. Many expected their loved ones to be broken or bitter. Instead, the returning POWs brought with them something Germany had not known for years: perspective. They spoke of the camps in Texas, the kindness of guards, the abundance of food, the fairness of the system. They described how their captors, the very people they had been taught to despise, had treated them with dignity. Some called it propaganda. Others listened in silence. But slowly, as more men came home and more stories spread, the myth of the enemy began to crumble. In post-war Germany, these returning soldiers became quiet teachers. Many took jobs in rebuilding efforts, teaching trades they had learned in captivity. Others joined the nascent democratic institutions of West Germany. Historians later noted that the influence of former POWs, especially those who had been held in the United States, played a key role in shaping the moral and civic culture of the new federal republic. They had seen firsthand how a free society functioned, and they carried that vision with them. One former prisoner, Franz Leopold, who had worked on an American farm in Arkansas, recalled, "The Americans showed us that strength does not need cruelty. They beat us with kindness, and that is why they won." He would later become a school teacher, telling his students that the most important lesson he ever learned came not from a classroom, but from behind barbed wire. For the United States, the POW program was more than a logistical success. It was a moral triumph. By the war's end, over 425,000 German prisoners had passed through American camps. Despite fears of sabotage or rebellion, escapes were rare, discipline remained high, and violence almost non-existent. Out of those hundreds of thousands, only a handful committed serious crimes. The reason was simple: the prisoners had no reason to hate their captors anymore. The American government spent millions feeding and housing its enemies, a choice often criticized during wartime. But in hindsight, it proved to be one of the most strategically effective humanitarian decisions of the 20th century. It showed the world, and especially the vanquished, that democracy could conquer without cruelty. By 1947, the last of the German POWs had left U.S. soil. Many sent letters of gratitude to their former guards. Some returned years later as immigrants, seeking the land where they had once been held. In towns like Hearne, Texas, and Algona, Iowa, former prisoners reunited with farmers who had once employed them, shaking hands as equals. "We were enemies once, but we learned we didn't have to stay that way." Not all memories were easy. Some POWs carried guilt for having lived well while their families starved in bombed-out cities. Others struggled to reconcile the decency they had seen in their captors with the horrors their own nation had committed. Yet for many, those contradictions became the foundation of a new moral compass. They had witnessed the difference between dictatorship and democracy not in theory, but in practice. Decades later, as Europe rebuilt and the Cold War began, historians and veterans alike would look back on the POW camps in America as something extraordinary, an experiment in mercy that paid strategic dividends. The German soldiers who returned home had not only survived, they had been transformed. They became living proof that how a victor treats the defeated can shape the peace that follows. One former Africa Corps officer summed it up best when he stood years later at a veterans reunion in Bremen. He said, "We were taught that mercy was weakness. America proved it is strength." In the end, the story of the German POWs in America was more than a tale of captivity. It was a mirror reflecting the best and worst of humanity in war. The Reich that had promised them glory abandoned them. The enemy they had sworn to destroy gave them dignity. And from that paradox, a generation of former foes would help build a freer, fairer Germany, one forged not by conquest, but by compassion.